What was the Roman commander's plan to save Paul's life? This is the question, and we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Acts chapter 23, verses 23 to 35. Before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Acts chapter 23, verse 23. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Acts chapter 23, beginning at verse 23. And he called for 2 centurions, saying, Prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night, and provide mounts to set Paul on, and bring him safely to Felix the governor. He wrote a letter in the following manner. Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and was about to be killed by them. Coming with troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And when I wanted to know the reason they accused him, I brought him before their council. I found out that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but had nothing charged against him deserving of death or chains. And when it was told me that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him immediately to you, and also commanded his accusers to state before you the charges against him. Farewell. Then the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. The next day they left the horsemen to go on with him, and returned to the barracks. When they came to Caesarea, and had delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from. And when he understood that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear you when your accusers also have come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. Paul has been arrested by the Romans and is being held in the Anatolia fortress, which is directly adjacent to the temple in Jerusalem. In our last lesson, the Roman commander learned of a plot to kill Paul, which involved the Jewish council asking to see Paul again under the guise of wanting to question him more, only to have Paul and the Roman guards ambushed on the way, and Paul killed in the process. That the Jewish council would act in such a corrupt way shows us that little has changed in the 30-some-odd years since the death of Jesus, even though membership on said council has. So the question is, how would the commander ensure that Paul wasn't killed, meaning that his own life would be endangered? Well, first of all, he would need to ensure that the contingent of soldiers that was transporting Paul was large enough to either deter or defeat the purported 40 Jews who had hatched this plot against Paul. So the Roman commander gathered 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to take Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea, where the Roman procurator of Judea was located. All these people to transport one prisoner was overkill, but such was the determination of the Roman commander to ensure that Paul, a Roman citizen, wasn't killed. The prisoner transport also wouldn't happen during the day to ensure that others wouldn't join the 40 trying to kill Paul, as others had joined those in the temple who dragged Paul out back in chapter 21. The hour for this transfer was the 3rd hour of the night, so around 9 to 10 o'clock. Remember that we're around Pentecost here, meaning that it's mid to late May by this point. In Jerusalem, the sun would set just before what we would call 8 p.m., so it could possibly even be a little later than 9 p.m., seeing as how these people didn't have watches like we do. Suffice to say, though, it was well enough after sunset to ensure the mob wouldn't form to help those who could be lying in wait. And perhaps by sending Paul at night, the commander might have hoped to avoid the band of would-be murderers entirely. Accompanying the soldiers would be a letter to Felix the governor. Felix was the procurator of Judea at that time, a position that Pontius Pilate held in the days of Jesus. His procurator service was from about 52 AD to 60 AD, meaning that we're at about 58 AD by this point because of something we'll learn about at the end of chapter 24. Felix himself was a cruel man, one that was often open to accepting bribes, something we'll also see in chapter 24. which led to an increase in crime during his time governing the region. At the beginning of the letter, we learn the name of the Roman commander who was holding Paul, a man by the name of Claudius Lysias. In writing to Felix, Lysias makes sure to butter Felix up by calling him the most excellent governor. Well, it is true that we often are cordial in our greetings. This type of greeting is usually reserved for a king or a queen, not a governor. From the content of the letter, it is obvious that Lysias wanted Felix to understand why Paul was coming to him in the first place, as well as how valiant he had been in getting him there. So if flattering Felix would help get that point across, that is what Lysias did. But in writing this letter, Lysias did embellish not only what he did, but how he came to know what he knew. It is true that in a sense Lysias rescued Paul from the hands of the Jews, but not because Paul was a Roman. For recall, he originally thought that Paul was an Egyptian. No, he rescued Paul only because there was a mob forming in the temple that needed to be quelled. Lysias had Paul bound and was going to scourge him in order to get Paul to talk if Paul hadn't asserted his Roman citizenship. In glossing over this fact, Lysias was saving his own skin in the matter, while at the same time passing the buck to Felix to deal with the matter himself. In truth, based on what Lysias revealed next, Paul could have been released, even if it meant sending Paul away secretly by night to the coast and commanding that Paul sail away. But that might have led to unrest, so the safer thing to do was to send Paul to Felix. If there was going to be a riot, let Felix be to blame, and not him, Lysias probably thought. But Lysias had to tell Felix what Paul had done, which of course was nothing that was worthy of death, but had seemingly broke some matter concerning Jewish law, which of course the Romans usually didn't enforce. And the reason that Paul was sent by night to Felix? Lysias said in the letter that it was because he discovered a plot. Once Paul was safely with Felix, by that time Lysias would have told Paul's accusers to come to him in order for the matter to be dealt with. So that was the letter. He gave that letter to those accompanying Paul, who then took him by night west out of Jerusalem to Antipatris, which is shown now on the screen. To get there from Jerusalem, you would have had to go through the hills, meaning that once they got there, assuming they got there safely, it would mean that the band of would-be murderers would have a harder time catching up to Paul before he reached Felix in Caesarea. That's why the soldiers left Paul with the horsemen in Antipatris and returned to Jerusalem. When Paul arrived before Felix, Felix read the letter and then wanted to know where Paul was from. When he understood that he was from the province of Cilicia, he decided to hear the matter when his accusers came. The reason that Felix asked this question is perhaps he was seeing if he had jurisdiction. When dealing with contentious matters, judges often like to dismiss things or pass off things to others on technicalities like this, so that they don't have to be responsible for making unpopular decisions. Cilicia evidently was in Felix's jurisdiction, though, so he would have to hear the matter. Until Paul's accusers came, Paul would be kept in Herod's praetorium in Caesarea. We'll see what happens next, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Acts chapter 24, verses 1 to 9, so we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.